be seated. Welcome to the Feast of Pentecost. Most Christians know all about the first two holidays of the Christian year, Christmas and Easter, the day that Jesus was born and the day that Jesus was raised from the dead. After those two, all bets are off, I think, especially in a church like Christ Church, which has as many people who came to this church from another denomination, like me, as from those who are so-called cradle Episcopalians. So there's a lot of us. So in the interest of those like me who came from a different denomination, let's have a short primer on Pentecost. Pentecost is the holiday about the Holy Spirit. We sometimes have a dove flying over the people in the church. It was here. I saw it. It almost hit me in the face. And we do that to remind ourselves that when Jesus was baptized, the Holy Spirit descended upon him like a dove. Since that time, the Holy Spirit has been symbolized by a dove. So we have doves, and we have special music. We have special red flowers. We have a party for Pentecost. We have food, and we have fun, and we'll have cake even. Who doesn't love cake? Because Pentecost is the unofficial birthday of the church. Remember, just before Pentecost, just days before, Jesus, who himself was about to ascend to heaven, Jesus promised his disciples that the Holy Spirit would come to them and give them power to love the world. And then, a few days after, on the actual day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit did just that. The Spirit did come and fell on the disciples with power as promised. So, that is why Pentecost is the birthday of the church. The day when individual disciples stopped being just passive recipients of what Jesus was trying to teach, and they became the disciples. They became who they were always supposed to be, alive to Christ and his mission of love to the world. Before Pentecost, before that day, they did not claim the power that was in them. Until that day, they hadn't been born as church. So, happy birthday, church. It's your day. You've got a dove, you've got a party, you got food, you got cake. These are some of the symbols of the day. Here's another one. In Pentecost, we wear red when we remember to do so. I can't tell you how many times I've forgotten to wear red on Pentecost, as many as not, to be sure. So if you've forgotten, you're in good company. There's no worries. On Pentecost, both the church and the people are decked out in red, and not just for the sake of it, but rather because red is the color of fire and the most important symbol of the Holy Spirit is fire. It comes from the Bible. We just heard it in the book of Acts. says, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to them to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them, and all of them were filled by the Holy Spirit. See? It's the fire. Pentecost had fire. It was though they were on fire, but they were not burned, not of the flesh. Like the way that shrub way back with Moses, remember that? That bush was on fire, but was not consumed. So it was with the disciples. They burned with power, a new power, burned with the power of love by the Holy Spirit. And as I often say from this pulpit, that changed everything. That changed everything for the disciples. But remember, it wasn't always that way. Rewind a few, weeks, a few weeks, a couple of months. Rewind from Holy Day. From the day after Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Remember that? Just a few weeks ago. Now known as Palm Sunday. Anybody? No? From that Monday, little by little, the disciples' fear grew. Have you ever had that feeling that something bad is going to happen, but you don't know just what it is? That's what the disciples were feeling. There was a growing storm cloud, a storm of dread coming right at them. Jesus had tried to tell them for years, 3 years, and now they can feel the danger. The disciples were afraid. Now it's Thursday night, the night of the Last Supper, after dinner, after washing their feet, after Judas left. Jesus goes on teaching them, but Philip could hardly take the tension. You feel the tension. Fear and anxiety, I think, not impatience as we suppose, but fear and anxiety permeates, I think, Philip's demand. What did he demand? Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied. It's like he's saying, show us the Father, and we won't be afraid. So from Monday through Thursday, from Good Friday to Jesus' death, through Saturday, all of that time, the disciples were afraid, even to the morning of Easter. Remember that? As St. Mark said, no one said anything because they were afraid. Fear characterized the disciples. Even when the risen Christ appeared to them, they were afraid, mingled with joy, to be sure, but they were afraid of the authorities. They were afraid of the Sanhedrin and the Romans. Even when the disciples settled down a little bit with the risen Christ over those 50 days, I feel like they were only unafraid when Jesus was with them. Like if he left them for any time, they would go back to fear. And who could blame them? And that wouldn't do. Jesus knows it. The only way to make the disciples truly believe that Jesus had work for them to do in his name was to let him go. And the only way that Jesus was going to do that, to let him go, is for the Holy Spirit to come, to help. And so Jesus promised the Holy Spirit, and then he ascended to heaven. Then and only then, I believe, with the Holy Spirit's help on Pentecost, could the disciples come into their own and get down to the work that Jesus had given them to do, which is, of course, loving. In that instant, all of their fears burned away. They went from being afraid to being alive in the Spirit, alive to love. The feast of Pentecost exists, at least in part, to remind us every day that we are on fire for love, with love, or we should be. Pentecost is every day. It is an everyday feast because Pentecost comes every day. It is the movable feast, if you like. Wherever you are, if you are on fire with the Holy Spirit, it is Pentecost. And Pentecost is about not being afraid, because the fire of the Holy Spirit is with us every second of every day. In the early months of my recovery, I experienced a lot of fear, real anxiety about my ability to come back to Christ Church, to you all. And that anxiety was debilitating from time to time. And it is for many people, for many reasons. But we don't have to face it alone. In the community of the church, we can face it together and allow the Holy Spirit to work through us for each other's sake. So let's make a pact this Pentecost. Let's not be afraid, because we have the Holy Spirit. It was fire that the Holy Spirit bestowed on the first Christians. They were so much on fire, they had to proclaim. They forgot to be afraid any longer. They spoke of something that made a difference in their lives. They were afraid, and then they weren't. That was the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of the living God. The story of Pentecost is about friends who had everything to fear. They were broken, paralyzed by fear, real fear, and yet on Pentecost they received a gift, the promised gift, the gift of the Holy Spirit, called Advocate, Helper, or Comforter, a spirit that encourages and equips them, the disciples, and us, to go out into the world, to reconcile, to forgive, to rejoice, to pray, to feed people, to be disciples, to make disciples. All of that and more, and all in one word, to love. You see? So, take courage on Pentecost. Do not be afraid. Emboldened by the Spirit, you and I together will find the courage not simply to resist fear, but to actually step out in confidence and joy. This is the day of the Holy Spirit. as it is every day. The Holy Spirit wants all of you. Your life, all of it. Not half of it. Not once a month. All of it. So that, in the words of the desert mystics, so that you can become all flame. Or as the French Jesuit theologian Desjardins, I knew I was going to be able to say that. By the way, my French is a little bit rusty since my stroke. He said, someday, after we have mastered the winds and the waves and gravity, then we shall harness for God the energies of love. And then, for the second time in the history of the world, we will have discovered fire. Pentecost changed everything for the disciples. It can change everything for you. Saints, on Pentecost, why not become all flame? Amen.